Desire's masterpiece, Considering the C Word and the Subject by Hunter Coates, as featured in The Map is Indestructible by O.G. Rose. Hunter Coates of Dissatisfied Philosophy has gifted us with a critical book connecting the C word, like the Q word, and the work of Lacan. And again, I can't say what the C word is or the Q word because of YouTube and problems I've had, so please check out the links to see what I'm referring to resume. And I completely agree that we need psychoanalysis to understand what forms of drives C-word thinking, what drives C-word thinking. As considering madness a state of irrationality keeps us from having to face the more disturbing reality that madness is a product of rationality, as discussed in Belonging Again, so considering the C-word as a product of losing touch with reality saves us from facing the truth that our natural experience of A-B reality makes us vulnerable to C-words. Rationality cannot objectively ground itself and must settle at best with an absolute knowing of its own limitations, as we learn in Hegel. And that means it is also possible for rationality to find itself seeing connections between a hand sign, a government official, the Vatican, and so a C-word is born. In other words, rationality is limited from not being able to see connections anywhere and in everything. After all, there is no absolute grounding to stop this unbound connecting. And so once Pandora's box is opened, as we spoke about with Lorenzo in episode 36, rationality never sees reason to close it. In fact, once the box is open, connections start to appear. Isn't that a sign? Section 1. As Lacan discusses, courtly dating is the recognition from a man that the woman must deny him immediate satisfaction so that they attain love, and C-words do something similar. They know they must deny us immediate understanding of the truth so that we commit to that truth. But as love easily turns out not to be what we thought it was, so it goes with C-words. They often turn out to orbit nothing at all or something banal, just as love turns out to never be the final resting place we easily imagined it to be. There is no final unity or final truth that unveils everything about the world, its governments, and our lives. Life is living with unknowing, but C-words precisely tempt us with a solution to this unknowing. We will know good and evil. All it takes is one bite. Aided by Britannica, in merging it with Lacan, Mr. Coates defines a C-word as an attempt to explain events as mediated and contingent on a non-lacking big other, which doubles itself in the subject's assumption of deception on behalf of the big other. C-words can be possible because we believe in a big other who can be known, and the supposed existence of that big other is strengthened by our very faith to the C-word framework in which we live and breathe. Belief in the C-word makes phenomenon toward us as evidence of it, as described in Self-Delusion, the Towardness of Evidence and the Paradox of Judgment by O.G. Rose, and eventually it seems crazy not to believe in that C-word, as for many it can seem crazy not to believe in God. We lock ourselves in a sealed and self-relating hermeneutic in which it becomes incredibly natural to interpret everything as evidence that we are in the right place at the right time, that it is everyone else who is locked inside a lie and outside the truth. And paradoxically, this state is obtained in the subject placing faith in the belief that the big other is all deceiving, raising deception itself to the status of a big other. Deception hence becomes a capital D, deception. This is a brilliant point from Coates, and it means that the very existence of deception comes to be evidence of the existence of deception, capital D, thus legitimizing the C-word. Believing in, capital D, deception, if someone tells us that we are deceived, we smile and nod. We have finally advanced from being the child asking, where do babies come from, to the parent who knows the answer. In the C-word, God is capital D, deception, and so we cannot learn the truth without killing God, and yet the hope of a C-word is precisely to learn the truth. We are thus prone in the C-word to end up in self-effacement as a snake that eats itself, but we can easily interpret this as the noble sacrifice needed so that the C-word is uncovered. C-words can address the meaning crisis, I fear. And if it never is uncovered, we still went down fighting. And didn't some C-words turn out to be true? Indeed, some did. And so others cannot readily say that we are necessarily wrong to consider this C-word. After all, what else might be hidden from us? The opioid crisis, Gulf of Tonkin, the Tuskegee syphilis study, even the replication crisis, all of these suggest that we can be deceived, and so belief in capital D deception is not necessarily crazy. The C-word subject gains a degree of its investigative drive. And that opening is all we need to give our lives to capital D deception. After all, there can be nobility in it, in taking the pitch and risk, as discussed in The Conflict of Mind. And what if we save some innocent people from a horrible syphilis experiment? Belief in capital D deception can save. Coates points that the other and big other in Lacan are not identical and maintain a difference, that there is a difference between the other who is my wife and the big other regarding the idea of what constitutes a wife and or marriage. The other suggests the big other, but I don't need to have a wife to live aware of the capital W wife per se and to organize my actions accordingly. Through wife, lowercase w always suggests capital W wife. There can be the wife without a wife per se. This suggests why C words are so powerful, for even if we discover that a given C word is false, the existence of capital C word and or capital D deception is not necessarily overturned in the same act. Just because this C word is absurd, it doesn't follow that all C words are false. In fact, perhaps the capital C word intentionally created some absurd C word so that we would think that all C words are bogus, thus protecting the capital C word from investigation. Deception wins. Capital D deception blocks us from the truth, which means deception naturally generates desire in its favor. From now on, I'll just say desire, and you can basically assume it's capital D. For desire is a blockade toward enjoyment, which means that we desire precisely where there is an obstacle, which is what deception can uniquely always provide. As long as we believe in deception, we will never be bored and always have meaning, for the blockade guarantees that we can always generate fantasy regarding what is across the blockade. If God is veiled, God is eternal, all-powerful, all-knowing, and so on. Deception will never leave us, and if someone tells us that we are deceived, deception proves its faithfulness. Our faith is not in vain. Though what Lacan means by the drive is often debated, Coates suggests that the drive is the subject's mechanism which provokes enjoyment through sacrifice, the short circuit itself. And blessed deception can always provide us means for short-circuiting and self-sacrifice. Perhaps there is no other way to gain meaning, both in that we can easily believe that deception could try to throw us in jail, in that researching deception could cost us friends, in that discussing deception is rejected by our co-workers. All of this confirms we are on the right track. Others are deceived, after all. Deception is afoot, for our lives are being ruined. Deception plots. We must stop it. Or are we immoral and cowardly? Incompletion is that which provokes enjoyment, and deception is always incomplete, and perhaps only deception is so readily and clearly incomplete and honest about its incompleteness. Deception is precisely that which denies us completeness, the truth. And so when we suffer incompleteness, we don't feel disappointed, such as we might when anything else proves incomplete, like a career, love, and so on. In this way, the incompleteness of deception might provide a paradoxical incompleteness with the I in parentheses, which is perhaps uniquely appealing in a world that increasingly suffers what Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis and all the other psychological tensions described in Belonging Again. The average person seems to be increasingly forced to face the reality that in this life completeness is impossible, and we can either face that fact and head in what I would argue is a Hegelian and or Nietzschean direction, or turn to deception. It would take another paper to justify, but I would argue that completeness we find in Hegel and Nietzsche is in fact an incompleteness, capital with the I in parentheses. So deception offers us a mirror image of what is actually best for humans, hence perhaps why it is so tempting. Unfortunately, in only understanding C words as irrational, we have failed to identify this threat. Section 3. C word relies on an ever-encompassing other, but is also paradoxically situated as an other, which questions the nature of the other. Thus, the other of the C word subject is the other of the deception by the other. A beautiful articulation by Coates. That was all a quote. And it makes me think how the danger of the Pentecostal God is precisely that God is never the God we think God is. God is always alive, active, and doing something unexpected, which unfortunately means that God can always be a source of paranoia. Protestants, aware of this problem, have perhaps tried to emphasize sola scriptura to keep God from becoming a source of C-word thinking. But then the risk is that God practically becomes a premise and philosophical notion, which means God can be more easily used. Thus the tension between givens and releases, which concerns Belonging Again. Between God being a source of paranoia and God being controlled for our benefit, there is great risk, but the risks of God are the risks of truth in general, and so we can see why it was not entirely irrational for science to try to replace philosophy. Science failed, as hopefully made clear throughout O.G. Rose, but we shouldn't be quick to celebrate this. Overturning reductionism to regain meaning, quote-unquote, is to open ourselves back up to the risks of deception. Perhaps nihilism isn't so bad. Anyway, the great Zizek is famous for helping us understand ideology in light of Lacan's liaisons, which Mikey has done great work on, and here we can see Coates as connecting liaisons and C-words. Personally, I think the structure of ideology and a C-word match as internally consistent systems. Matthew Stanley also explains liaisons at Samsara Diagnostics, what is liaisons, enjoyment, pleasure, pain. But basically, we can understand it for our purposes here as how humans find pleasure in pain and pain in pleasure, which makes us prone to self-sabotage, self-deception, and a host of ironies. We can enjoy not being able to access the thing in itself, which means we can enjoy deception because it is deception. Capital T truth might be less enjoyable, which we cannot ever directly say, or deception would lose its enjoyment as deception, for it would become a distraction, capital D, that we would have to experience as a distraction. Self-deception only works when we don't know it's self-deception. Brilliantly incorporating Hegel into his argument, Coates makes the point that all of reality is always mediated to us. The object in immediacy is never a whole or complete object, but that means everything can be influenced by liaisons. Indeed, everything can be incorporated into deception. Deception abounds. Coates explores psychosis and psychotic foreclosure, the role of the symptom, and many other concepts from Lacan that can help shed light on C-words and their operations. Lacan teaches us that there is a void in all social bonds, so why not make our main social bond the void itself? Hence the appeal of deception and why it is a rational response to being increasingly forced by modernity, globalism, pluralism, and so on to face the realities of Lacan's thinking and inescapability of lack. If we must be incomplete, then let us make incompleteness a deception which can give our lives direction, while suggesting there is something holding the world together. Hence, we enclose ourselves in deception and find meaning in that enclosure which we enjoy. The meaning crisis is thus solved. To further secure our meaningful enclosure, we can add some scapegoats who either withhold enjoyment from us, ergo who deny deception and the C-word and thus work for the D-word and are deceived, or who are the masterminds of the C-word, like the shadows who control the media and so on, and thus we are saved. Coates tells us that capitalism has an unholy alliance with C-word today, and indeed capitalism can learn how to channel our enjoyment of deception in its favor. Hollywood will give us all the movies about C-words we want, which further makes us feel like C-words might be real, all while giving us the cover of saying it's just a movie, which itself feels like deception. And at the same time, capitalism lets us serve and consider deception so that our lives feel meaningful, like we belong to a community of seekers and so on. Capitalism likes deception, for deception can help us feel appeased so that we can participate in capitalism peacefully, like a good worker. Paradoxically, C-words can also isolate us into the world of ego, and yet in that ego we feel part of something. Deception atomizes us into smaller and weaker units, while at the same time pacifying us as if we aren't so isolated. It's all capitalism could ever ask for, it seems. The system might love being seen as evil by the deceived, for then others will likely see opposing the system as absurd, and so the system will not be opposed but by a small group of the deceived. Likely small, for it doesn't feel like we are opposing a C-word if everyone knows about it. On this point, it's possible that the January 6th insurrections were beneficial for capitalism and the state, for it made opposing both associationable with the actions of absurd and brainwashed C-word theorists. Who wants to be associated with those people? And so the system breaks the world into those who are pacified by their secret knowledge and meaning of and from deception, and if those followers rebel against the system, they make opposing the system seem absurd. And so those who don't follow deception see reason not to oppose the system, for that is what the deceived do. And thus the system wins. Either people are trapped in C-words, which render them irrelevant, or people accept the state so that they aren't one of the deceived. Deception wins. Section 4. Hunter's book covers much more than I've reflected on in this short work, with wonderful considerations of Baudrillard, Freud, U.S., and Hegel, elaborations on Q and Trump, the elaborations of C-word. I highly suggest the text. Here, I will close with considerations of Hegel, which I think can help us understand why C-word and deception are so powerful. Hunter makes the point that Hegel understood that if we say a thing is a collection of properties, we have fallen into a contradiction. For there is no thing to be properties, just properties being properties. There are just properties becoming together as a contentless being of negativity that holds existing properties, a strange and paradoxical state that Hegel suggests defines all phenomenon. And it seems to me that C-words are the same and a revelation of how all phenomenon are actually like. Deception is a great lack, which holds together properties, ideas, pieces of evidence, notions, and so on, and yet there is nothing, only deception. Likewise, things are a great lack, which hold which hold together properties, ideas, pieces of evidence, notions, and so on, and yet there is no thing. Everything is like a deception. And perhaps this means that we are trained by our very phenomenological experience of the world to be vulnerable and susceptible to C-word thinking. To be C-word then and fall into deception is simply to operate according to our rationality, which has been trained by our experience of things. Deception reigns because we have been in the world and of it. Coates writes, in this sense, the tree is a jumble of opposing properties, the shape of the leaves, the color brown, the color green, yet somehow it stays composed and together. This somehow is the point that we have arrived at, since the medium of the tree is not a property, but still an existing aspect of the tree. So what is that? What is it that holds all the properties of the tree as an also? Question mark. This sounds like a C word, yes? Somehow all the ideas, images, symbols, plots, celebrities, pizza potters, and so on stay composed and together. The power of deception is the unbound also, which is to say any and everything can be incorporated, which is to say nothing must necessarily unveil the deception is in fact be deception. Hunter points out that Hegel says we must move outside the representation of the tree in immediacy to what is not the tree, which suggests for me the need to move from AA to AB, though that is another topic for another time. And this is arguably the move that happens with C words. When we read the conspiratorial Q Wikipedia page, and it sounds absurd, the deceived would tell us we cannot look there, but must look outward. For what we see is by definition not the truth of the deception, but a mechanism of deception. Of course, the deception is precisely a deception because there is no truth, but the deception is also precisely a deception because it acts as if there is a truth. And so the deception is consistent with itself, which perhaps makes it honest and trustable, funny enough. Anyway, in this we see that the act which keeps deception alive parallels the act which we must carry out in our understanding of things for Hegel. What is there is not what is there, AB, and so we must look on. In this, as discussed throughout O.G. Rose, we see the dramatic danger of AB thinking, and hence my sympathy for those who sought AA and autonomous rationality. But unfortunately, this will not work. We must see Hegel through. C words might work because they are structured like reality itself, AB, and as we experience things as not what they are, so we are indirectly habituated and trained to believe in deception, that things are not what they are. A consideration of absolute knowing in Hegel might further the point. Here, I insist on Zizek's interpretation of Hegel's absolute knowledge as the recognition of the big others in existence. Therefore, each moment in history limits itself, but this supposed external limit is not a Kantian blockage which prevents us from the totality of being, noumenon. It is the Kantian horizon of ontological finitude which undergoes the further Hegelian step and transcribes into itself the one external limit by means of the dialectical process. This transcription into itself continues the movement of history. With every declassification of documents by the CIA, a C word previously denied to us becomes a limit, which is part of our knowledge, and then it turns out that the C word was hardly a deception, but just the everyday boring activity of the U.S. government doing what it always does. C words are often banal. Learning their truth does not unlock the mysteries of the universe or cause the sky to roll up like a scroll. There is often a disappointment in C words, as there can be a disappointment in love, in fame, in achieving a goal, and the like. There is no big other. And yet the next C words might be different. It already might be. Thus, it always might be. Thus, with each C word and prior limit incorporated into history, deception lives on, and the previous boring C words actually help keep the deception alive, as if necessary sacrifices. For if they were true, what else might be true? Coates tells us that absolute knowing recognizes 3 points in Hegel: the inability of limitation, of seeing the world as whole or in itself, the inability to see beyond the now, the inability to see beyond the immediacy and self-consciousness of the I. These are principles according to which deception also operates. Deception and absolute knowing mirror. As in Christianity, evil is a privation of the good, which means the substance of evil must be good. Gluttony, which is bad, must be a disordered relation to food, which is good. So the substance of deception is absolute knowing, which is to say the ontological condition of absolute knowing is precisely what makes deception possible. And so the very rationality which can lead us to absolute knowing is also what can lead us to deception. Avoiding deception is not a matter of being more rational, as I fear we often believe, but in fixing a disordered relation of rationality with the world. Since absolute knowing is true, which is to say the world is ontologically incomplete, AB, we are always at risk of deception, as the existence of food means we are always at risk of gluttony. The only possible management of the problem is addressing ourselves as subjects. We must train ourselves to use thinking well, but what that means will require pages to describe. Section 5. To review, deception teaches that the truth is what we are denied the truth, and so when we do not find the truth in deception, deception told the truth, and so we keep trusting deception and perhaps become addicted to the enjoyment deception faithfully provides us. Deception teaches that we are always denied the truth, and indeed we are. There is no big other, a truth for which we are thankful, but we are given constant enjoyment. Belonging again speaks of Confucian's masterpiece, alluding to Macbeth, and here we can see why. Deception and C-word are desire's masterpiece. Deception is honest that we never reach the object, a state which is reaching the object, and so deception is practically indestructible. And so we never have to worry about our fantasies being destroyed. We are always deceived and complete in deception, and so we are always enjoying. If we investigate a deception, as we must to some carefully curated degree to convince ourselves of the legitimacy of the deception and fail, as we must, this is evidence of the deception. We didn't find anything because we are being kept from finding anything. If someone tells us that we are deceived under deception, this will likely strike us as absurd, for we are in the C-word and under the deception precisely because we want to know the truth. We want to get to the bottom of what the state is doing, what the government is plotting, so on. For someone to tell us that we are deceived when we're committed to the truth, wherever it leads, even if it leads to us being called deceived, how absurd. And so those who tell the deceived that they are deceived are likely to be met with knowing smiles and nods, signs that a masterpiece of enjoyment is present. We ultimately cannot obtain the object kept from us by deception, but this only proves the deception. The ultimate failure of deception is the structure of deception. The failure is evidence the structure succeeds. And in this way, we see how similar deception is to absolute knowing, but while deception is incompletely complete, epistemological, absolute knowing is incomplete, with the ion in parentheses, onto epistemology, a subtle and slight difference that makes all the difference. Demons are fallen angels. Deception entails a lack of the truth whole, which we never gain, but this lack is outside of us in the world, epistemological, kept from us by the state, whereas in absolute knowing, the lack of the whole is part of us, ontological. Deception still follows AA, but is always practically AB, while absolute knowing is AB throughout. To suggest whole hope by O.G. Rose, deception gives us an always present lack that can always be a source of fantasy and ever whole, but this lack is not essential but accidental, to allude to Aristotle, which is to say it is always about to be filled, and the truth whole, with the truth whole, and so never is, while in absolute knowing we receive an always present lack that denies being a source of fantasy, for it is reality, AB. Our challenge is to become whole, with the W in parentheses, with it. Deception is a false integration with lack and keeping the lack external in the C-word and deception, while absolute knowing can be a true integration with lack and bringing the lack internally into us, ontological. Deception places an ever lack in the world and as us. Paradoxically, the lack of deception is always incomplete, about to be complete, while in absolute knowing, the lack is incomplete with the ion in parentheses, which strangely sublates the lack into a feature and hence not a lack in a way. Though perhaps less enjoyable, absolute knowing is a more incomplete, ion in parentheses, though perhaps incompleteness, ion in parentheses, makes possible a special kind of joy, as perhaps found in intrinsic motivation. C-words are complete in incompleteness, that is always about to be complete, epistemological, while absolute knowing is incomplete, ion in parentheses, that is never about to be complete, onto epistemological. In deception, we come to enjoy the lack which is always about to be filled, and so when it isn't ever filled, we're fine with it, while in absolute knowing, we must hope in a joy of wholeness, with the W in parentheses. Like deception, Kant's noumenon is also a masterpiece of desire, for if we never reach things in themselves, they can always be sources of enjoyment. Perhaps we dislike Hegel because he makes limits something we control, and thus cannot guarantee us an infinite source of fantasy. Kant makes limits something outside our control, which means we can enjoy fantasy without being responsible for it. We are victims of fantasy, a dream come true. While Hegel makes limits something we are responsible for, which means we are responsible for our fantasies, a curse. A part of fantasy is the fantasy that fantasy does what it wants with us. We're imperfect and thus would mess it up, and we can also consider Girard's thinking on sadism and masochism here. And in Kant we can find that fantasy, while Hegel makes fantasy ours, a burden. Perhaps we have wanted to treat Hegel's writing as impenetrable to stay in enjoyment provided by Kant. Hard to say. The C-word of deception is the revelation of the structure of all worldviews, and as Hegel teaches, we must make the contradiction central to thinking, following Todd McGowan, so we need to make the C-word central to worldviewing. As othering the C-word has hurt philosophy, so othering the C-word has hurt our understanding of ideology, and as a result, politics, society, and the like have suffered. It seems absurd to treat contradiction and C-word as essential, but both suggest the essence of reality as AB versus AA. They are not outliers and mistakes, but glimmers of how the world actually is, which is, according to the ontology of Hegel, more than popular Kantianism. Ultimately, the map is indestructible because reality is incomplete with the I in parentheses, which means every worldview, because of the ontological nature of the world they all view, is at risk of falling into a deception from which nothing ever necessarily escapes. This doesn't mean escape is impossible, but it does mean that we need to take seriously the problem we find ourselves in just by virtue of thinking. Fortunately, in the work of Hunter Coates, we have resources for facing and managing that great challenge of life. For more about OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. And for the rest of The Map is Indestructible, you can now purchase it on Amazon, and all purchases and reviews are deeply appreciated. And you may also find Hunter Coates' work on Amazon, which is highly suggested. And thank you so much for your time.